Shopping malls are meant to be places of leisure, laughter, and escape from the ordinary. But hidden behind the bright lights and familiar storefronts are stories far darker than most would imagine. The following accounts are based on true events, gathered from eyewitnesses, survivors, and public reports. Some details have been altered for privacy, but the fear, confusion, and chilling aftermath remain very real. These stories may contain disturbing content, including violence, abduction, and psychological trauma. Reader discretion is strongly advised. You may never look at your local mall the same way again. Story 1. Returns not accepted. People seem to know this by now, or at least they should. But most adult shops these days aren't anything like the sleazy dens they're still imagined to be. You know the stereotype. Some dude in a trench coat scurrying in and out, ducking under his collar with a paper bag full of smut tucked under one arm, as if buying a vibrator was the moral equivalent of robbing a bank. That might have been true once. I'm sure the industry had its seedy beginnings, but the adult stores of today are often cleaner, brighter, more inclusive than most strip mall boutiques. You walk in and it smells like lavender and silicone polish. There's tasteful lighting, soft music, polished display cases, no sticky pink carpet, no moaning VHS loops playing on a grainy ceiling-mounted TV, no shadowy booths behind beaded curtains. I've seen it myself, but that's not the kind of place I worked in. No, the shop I worked in for almost 3 years, Angel's Delight, let's call it, which was actually the name of a competing store my bosses hated, was part of a dying single-story mall out on the outskirts of Bumlick nowhere. I wish that were an exaggeration, but I swear I've driven through towns that were bigger than this mall. It was a forgotten kind of place, nestled between an abandoned Sears and a liquor store with an unlit sign, where foot traffic had become a quaint memory long before I got there. And still, for a business that specialized in battery-operated boyfriends, blow-up dolls, and lurid VHS tapes that came in oversized cardboard sleeves, we were one of the classiest joints in that godforsaken building. That says a lot, doesn't it? I don't like to speak ill of other mall workers, retail solidarity and all, but man, some of the characters I shared that sinking ship with were straight out of a fever dream. There was a tattoo artist who I swear to God couldn't draw a straight line if you handed him a ruler. He'd ink stick figures on people's skin that somehow managed to look like melting crayons. Then there was the piercing studio, run by a chain-smoking couple who looked like they got their sanitation license off a cereal box. You'd see kids walking out of there with their cartilage piercings, already red and angry-looking, basically boarding the express train to Sepsisville. The liquor store was even worse. Rumor had it the bottles in the back weren't just for drinking. Pills, powders, and things that came in tiny Ziploc bags allegedly moved faster than vodka did. And then, bizarrely, there was the upscale fashion boutique, high-end as hell, all white walls and gold accents, run by a sour-faced elderly couple who looked like they'd stepped straight out of a 1950s sermon about moral decay. They hated us, or pretended to, but every Friday night, without fail, they'd swing by Angel's Delight, and they wouldn't browse. They'd make a beeline for the adult film wall, zero in on one particular corner of the VHS section, and pluck a tape with surgical precision. Every single time, the husband would lean on the counter with that same forced smile and say, "Just doing our part to get this filth off the streets," while his wife clucked her tongue like a disapproving chicken. And yet, somehow, they only ever cleansed the streets of tapes featuring one very specific niche, produced by one very specific company, with titles like Basement Confessions 4 and Glory Hole Gospel, serialized plots too. Maybe they watched it for the story arcs. By that point, I didn't care. I'd heard that excuse so many times, we buy them for the articles, that I could say it in my sleep. Hell, if it weren't for the self-righteous trenchcoat brigade buying their weekly dose of degeneracy, my bosses wouldn't have had the cash to pay me, and I needed that paycheck more than I needed to judge anyone. See, I'd done 1 year of college before realizing I'd dug myself into a financial pit. Just that 1 year had been enough to smother me in student loans. So I hit pause, determined to work my way back, save enough, and return to school debt-free. Adult shop manager wasn't the only job I could get, but it was the best paying one. Apparently, the position was weirdly hard to fill. When I interviewed, my bosses told me I was only the second person to apply in 6 months. When I asked what happened to the first applicant, they just looked at each other and said, "Some folks are so creepy they scare away the fantasy crowd." And then they laughed in a way that made me not want to know more. I worked there longer than I ever thought I would. Eventually, I started to ask myself, maybe I don't go back to college. Maybe I just ride this out, build a real career in this niche industry. My boss seemed optimistic, too, said the early 2000s were going to be huge for brick-and-mortar adult retail. And then that night happened. It was a quiet Friday evening in the fall. The sun had dipped below the parking lot horizon, and most of the mall had already shut down. We kept later hours, lonely hours. Mr. and Mrs. High Fashion had already picked up their latest VHS selection and clucked their way out. I'd just finished restocking the gag gifts display when the front door exploded inward, with enough force to send the little bell flying off its bracket and skittering across the tile. The man who entered didn't sneak, he stormed. He was tall, really tall, easily 6'5", maybe more. Not broad, kind of spindly actually, but he had that angular, bony kind of presence that made him hard to ignore. Gaunt cheeks, narrow eyes, stringy black hair that hung limp around his shoulders, like he'd just stepped out of a rainstorm that existed solely for him. He walked straight up to the counter, slammed down a brown paper bag, and jabbed a finger toward it like it owed him money. "This product is defective," he said, "and I'm returning it for a refund." I blinked, glancing at the massive no returns sign on the wall behind me. It was literally bigger than the cash register. Still, I said, "Sir, we don't accept returns, store policy." "You will accept this one," he snapped. I wasn't about to reach into a mystery bag. The bosses had warned me, urban legends or not, about jokers trying to return used toys, like very used. And whether it was real or not, I wasn't taking chances. "What item are we talking about here?" I asked. "Can you take it out of the bag?" He sighed dramatically, like I was the one being difficult. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pulled the item from the bag and set it on the counter. It was a rubber mask, not a costume mask, a fetish mask. Latex with molded features, a wide mouth hole connected to a hose, and a manual pump hanging from it like some kind of obscene party balloon setup. Think gas mask meets other things. It was old. I recognized it immediately because we'd had exactly one of those in stock since the day I started. And sometime in the last few weeks, it had vanished from the wall, sold on someone else's shift. "What's the issue?" I asked. He held it up and pointed to a jagged tear near the neck seam. "It's ripped. It tore the first time I used it. I didn't even get to inflate it." I squinted at the material. It looked dry, brittle. Latex like that can degrade after a while, crack, warp, even corrode if not stored right. Honestly, it might have been sitting on our wall since the Clinton administration. I didn't doubt the guy. It probably was defective. But policy was policy. "Sorry," I said. "We don't do returns, even for damaged items. I can give you a discount on a replacement." He didn't let me finish. In a single fluid movement, he reached across the counter, grabbed the back of my head, and slammed my cheek into the desk. Hard. My vision swam. I felt the cold press of rubber against my temple. He was pinning my face against the broken mask, the stupid little hand pump jabbing into my skin. Then he leaned down, breath hot in my ear. "Listen here, you smug little smut peddler," he growled. "I don't care about your policies. I got sold a defective product. Would you pay for someone else's mistake? No? Then why the hell should I?" He pressed harder. My skull throbbed. The edge of the counter cut into my cheekbone. I tried to speak, but the desk muffled my words. Then I felt it. Something cold, metallic, pressed just behind my ear. "I want my refund." I didn't see it. Could have been a gun. Could have been a bluff. But the weight of it, the cold certainty, it felt real. And in that moment, I didn't care what it was. I just wanted to live. He let go. I scrambled upright, heart hammering, and reached for the cash drawer with trembling fingers. I gave him $60. The mask had cost $49.99, but I couldn't count straight. He smiled, took the cash, stuffed the mask back into his bag, and left without another word. No witnesses, no proof, no security cameras, just me, the broken bell, and the rubber mask-shaped dent in the counter. I told my bosses, expected disbelief. Instead, one just nodded slowly. "Oh yeah, him." The other sighed. "Next time, just process the return." There was no next time. I gave my notice the very next morning. 2 weeks later, I was done. I used the money I'd saved and went back to college. never looked back. And every time I see a no refund sign now, I wonder who else had to learn that policy the hard way. Story 2. I'll get this out of the way up front. My name is Paul, and I was a mall cop. You'd think this would have been unbearable, but I served my stint as a security guard at a certain small-town mall in... So I'd left the job before the movie came out. I worked in private security now, but back then I was employed directly by the mall. It wasn't a huge mega mall by any means, but it had a couple of stores, about stores in fact, and a food court and a central fountain that the kids would throw coins into and make a wish. What this mall did have was a huge warehouse complex at the back. This is one of the big draws for businesses in the mall. They got a portion of the warehoused area as part of their lease to store stock and what have you, and some of them didn't need it and others took advantage of it. Then, other local businesses would lease warehouse space to store their own goods and items. The point is, this mall had a large maze of interior storage units out the back, so the area of the mall that shoppers saw was maybe only % of the property. Shoppers would stroll around browsing Radio Shack or Borders or that one store that always stuck out to me, Gadzooks. All sorts of clothing stores too. I won't explain the mall layout. Exactly. It was haphazardly built, kind of a pain in the ass to get around, and sometimes you could find yourself in one section of the mall's upper floor, and you'd have to go down one escalator and back up another to get to the other side. If by any small chance anyone who lived in the area around the S is listening, this description plus the storage warehouses is probably enough to make it clear which mall I actually mean. If you know, you know, as my kids say. I'm painting this picture so you understand that the mall wasn't some big open-plan architectural masterpiece with wide walkways for shoppers. It was cramped, claustrophobic, and by the time I started working there in this, it was already feeling run down and out of time. Couple that with a huge warehouse complex out back, and you can imagine why they needed round-the-clock security. There was a lot to explore, a lot of hidden corners that could hide all sorts of ill behavior, and for the first year in the job, I barely had to deal with anything more than a few shoplifters. One old guy was perving on a young woman, a missing kid who was found safe and well sitting in a photo booth, and a few kids who got dared to try and sneak into the warehouse to stay overnight. Weirdly, they were the ones that management came down on the hardest, really wanted to prosecute them to the full extent of the law. In the end, nothing came of it. They were barely older than, but the bosses were weirdly angry about someone trying to stay in the mall overnight, I guess. When you think about it, they could have caused untold damage. But like I said, we were our security detail, so one of us on shift would have caught them pretty quickly. The weirdness really began a couple of years into the job. The first time my buddy Chris and I were on a mall shift, and an older, more seasoned guy, Ben, was in the security office monitoring the cameras. It was mid-afternoon, midweek, and the mall was average busy. Then I get a call over the radio. It's Bryn. He told me we had a code, whatever in my sector, and for an unattended package. Now this was one thing that would make most of us jumpy. We were only a few years past the Oklahoma City bombing, and tensions were still high about any abandoned packages or vehicles in populated public areas. We never had a direct bomb threat, but we'd found a few abandoned bags and things. I guess we were pretty reckless because we'd never called in a bomb squad. Usually you could just see that they were things shoppers had bought and accidentally left beside a bench and whatnot. This time it was one of those filthy duffel bags tucked underneath a bench in the corner overlooking the central fountain. Nobody was looking at it when I reached the area Bryn directed me to. I'm not sure if nobody had noticed or nobody cared, but I remember that damn bag like it was yesterday. It was dirty, like it had regularly been rolled in dust and debris, and maybe chalk. And as I got closer, it was clear that it stank of piss of all things. I remember thinking, who pisses on a goddamn bomb? And that's why I just sort of strolled up to that damn bag and grabbed it, just swung it out from under the bench. I know I was an effing idiot, and I put lives at risk. Present day, me would give my past self a swift backhand to the head, but I was a dumb kid. And in my defense, as I'd gotten close, I could see the bag was open and that there were clothes inside. And that's where the piss stink was coming from. And that's what was in the bag. A black sweater, a pair of black jogging pants, a pair of black socks, all stinking and clearly well were worn. No big deal. I thought someone just kind of abandoned their old clothes after buying a new fit that day, I guess. The only slightly odd thing was the filthy plush cat also tucked into that duffel bag. Clearly an old, much-loved childhood toy. I don't remember much about it, to be honest, but at the time I just shoved it back into that duffel bag, a bit disgusted at the smell, and tried to push down any thoughts of what the cuddly toy might imply or who it belonged to. I radioed Bin that everything was fine. It was just a bag of clothes, and took it out to the dumpsters out back, making sure to thoroughly wash my hands afterwards. Didn't even get reprimanded for my reckless decision to grab a potential bomb. Nothing happened for a week or two, and then, like deja vu, I get a message over the radio again from Bryn about an abandoned bag. Don't be a dumbass with it. This time, kid. He'd seen me swipe it up on the cameras, of course, so not much point in hiding it from him, and I confirmed that I would not. Went to the area that he directed me to beside one of those fake plants in another forgotten corner of the mall, and sure enough, there was an identical duffel bag. This one didn't reek, though, and it was clearly a newer bag, but aside from that, it was the same. This time it was more out in the open, so even though it was a bit reckless, I was able to approach and sort of peer into it without touching anything again. I know I was an idiot for not even calling this one in, but to my underdeveloped mind, I could see that it was clothes again, so it was going to be the same thing, and I was sort of right. There was no plush cat this time, or toy of any kind. Instead, there were a few food wrappers, junk food that you get from a grocery store, sort of like Twinkies and beef jerky, that kind of thing, and some packaged goods. So either that was a goddamn weird coincidence, or the same guy had left the same generic set of clothes in the same brand of duffel bag lying around the mall twice in 1 month. Despite this one not being so foul, I still disposed of it in the dumpsters out back and really thought nothing of it beyond mentioning it to Bryn and a couple of other colleagues. The next duffel bag sighting came only a few days later. This time one of the store workers had found it in a female dressing room, and by now talk of the previous 2 duffel bags that I had found had spread around some of the workers, which I guess is why they called this in. I remember talking to the girl who called it in. She was barely over, and she went totally white when I said that it could have been an explosive device. Hadn't even considered it. I acted all macho and sort of stern about it, like I'd been the picture of responsibility when I'd found mine. Yeah, not really. The girl had already opened the bag, so there were no surprises this time, except for the smell. This one stank, even worse than the first one. Really old, musty, rotten almost. Thankfully no piss this time, but that didn't make it better. The girl looked like she was about to puke, so being the gallant, manly security guard that I was, I took it off of her hands and, you guessed it, to the dumpster out back. This time I didn't even check if there was anything else in there besides clothes. I wasn't touching that crap. And so by now we've had 3 abandoned identical duffel bags with 3 abandoned identical sets of clothes. I think it was Chris who first brought this up one day on break, and due to the job, it was rare for us to take breaks at the same time as each other. But for some reason that day we were. Maybe there's someone living in the mall, he said. He was joking, but I latched onto it, coming up with arguments about why. That could be right, how it made sense, etc. In the end, I think Chris kind of got annoyed with me and left, telling me that I was some conspiracy theorist or something like that, and maybe he just didn't want to deal with the possibility. But no, hear me out. My logic went like this: 3 identical duffel bags, 3 generic identical outfits. 2 of them had clearly been dumped because they were stinking and old. And who knows about the middle bag? Maybe there was some damage to the clothes that I didn't see because I didn't exactly examine them or anything. Maybe the guy had crapped his pants that time. Who knows? So I started putting together reasons why the details could be the way that they were, because the guy was taking them out of the storage warehouses. They were stock from one of the clearance outlets. Is in the mall, you know the type. Sells cheap clothing bags, all that good stuff. So this guy was dressing in cheap clothing from the warehouse and living in there. When I present it all Like this, it makes me sound like some crack detective who worked this out in seconds with one of those boards with red string and all of that kind of stuff. It wasn't like that. It took a few weeks for me to put all these pieces together. It's something I thought about absently from time to time. And during this period, a fourth duffel bag had been found in one of the men's public restrooms on the first floor. Nothing to do with me that time, but I heard about it from the guy who found it. And this time, it had been found emptied all over the ground. The contents kind of just strewn about. The theory was that someone else had found it before us and gone through it to see if there was anything worth stealing. Hell, maybe there had been, but I don't think so. It was just the old clothes or more perishable food wrappers. My chance came a few weeks later. It was my turn to switch with the night guys, and I liked the night shift. I was just coming out of a bad breakup at the time, so I liked the silence, the time. To think I've always been that kind of person when there's badness afoot. I like to be by myself, kind of lost in my own head. And I have a couple of creepy hiking experiences because of this that I might send in one day. Who knows? And so I was glad that I had the night shift because I needed the space for my head. But I also am glad because it gave me an excuse to poke around the warehouse unimpeded. I tried to bring it up with colleagues in the previous weeks, but the senior boys in particular were very keen to dissuade us from poking around back there. And at the time I started to entertain some really weird thoughts about it all, but later discovered that it was totally unconnected. Some local business that rented this space did so under the agreement that poking around wouldn't happen. And I guess that explains the haphazard security camp coverage in the warehouse areas. Two certain areas, especially inside Warehouse B, were complete camera blind spots for the most part. I had a pretty strong suspicion that the blind spot areas, and thus the areas my night shift led me to patrol the most, were where someone might actually be hiding. I've told events slightly out of order because I guess I have a flair for the dramatic. And in the weeks leading up to the start of my night shift, I'd become convinced that I was seeing things, nothing wild, not talking or creepy, past a tear, just obvious things. Glimpses of black-clad men carrying that specific black duffel bag, always blending into a crowd or disappearing around a corridor. People whose faces I could never get a full look at, who always seemed to be deliberately keeping just out of my reach. But at the time I knew that I'd look like a nut job if I pursued that or even told anyone. Hell, maybe in the years since I've built it up in my head and remember it happening more often than it did. But it's enough that even looking back now, it gives me, the grown-ass man who's worked some tough security jobs, the shivers. There was something about the shapelessness of it, the idea that someone wearing black was sneaking around the mall, my mall, even though they hadn't done anything bad except for leaving stinking clothes around. Well, not yet anyway. So first night shift I almost ran to the Warehouse B route in eagerness. Dumb, I know, but when I got there I kind of paced myself, started walking the route normally. The warehouses had lights and we were allowed to have them on during patrol, so it wasn't some sinister pitch-black walk through the dark, or at least it wasn't meant to be. I walked the route, probably whistling, trying to look like a picture of doesn't care to who, no idea, and this area wasn't even covered by cameras. But then I started looking a little closer at things. Just take a look, I thought. You know, and I remembered this shelving unit belonged to one of the clothing clearance stores, and I figured that it wouldn't hurt to double-check. The boxes, you know, that kind of thing. Look, I was trying to convince myself in my own head that I wasn't investigating. The idiotic idea of someone living in the back corridors and hidden corners of the mall, because obviously that wasn't happening. How could it have been? Why would someone? But then I found the nest. Yeah, okay. It wasn't a nest like that, not some creature's lair, but it was a collection of boxes on a huge bottom shelf that had been opened and taped together to form a kind of tiny room. It was barely disguised, and I have no idea how anyone missed it before I found it. To this day, there's a tiny part of me that suspects that he wanted to be found, and specifically by me, because I had been the one to find his first duffel bag. And I'm sure that's just my dramatic side talking again, but you know, you start to wonder. As mall security, we had these extendable baton things, and I never had a cause to use mine for violence. And I hoped that night wouldn't change that. But I had been waiting for an excuse to extend it with a whooshing wrist flick motion in the line of duty, which I did at that moment, or at least tried to. Of course, that's the time that it didn't work properly, and the baton got stuck, and I had to extend it by hand, and I'd shown that move off to buddies God knows how many times. And the one time I finally got to use it, I fumbled it, so I approached this obvious nest of boxes. Of course, I didn't know what was inside at this point, just that it was a bunch of boxes taped together, and I could see an opening in a space beyond. "Hey, anyone in there?" I called out. "My giving you one chance to come out with your hands up." I don't know why I said with your hands up. We didn't carry guns. It just sounded like something I should say. "Yeah," I called out, or something else, and there was no movement from inside the box. And I reached forward with my baton and parted the flap that served as a door, and holy crap, Ola, the stench. It was, honestly, like chemical warfare, Jesus Christ. And until that point I'd had no idea that the simple odor of the human body could end up being that foul. It wasn't soil from a human or anything like that. It was purely the stench of human existence. No wonder this guy, and it obviously was this guy, kept disposing of his bags of clothes. There was a bundle of generic brand sleeping bags in the nest. One clearly slept in, and the others used for padding. I mean, the guy had access to all of this backlog stock, so why not? There were also 2 or 3 of the black duffel bags in there, still in cellophane wrapping, and a stack of the generic black clothes that I've been finding. I backed up a little bit and assessed my surroundings, trying to place which store this particular area of storage belonged to, and then things clicked into place. The shelving area had belonged to the budget clothing store that had gone out of business last year. I guess for whatever reason they shut down suddenly and left their stock behind, and eventually someone would have come to clear it out. I had no idea what happened in a case like that. Though I wasn't a retail worker, I do remember that around then it was unusual, but not unheard of, for a store to suddenly shut down and clearance generic brand clothing sold cheap. You don't have to be a genius to connect that kind of store with sweatshops, so who knew what possible reasons could have led to a shutdown and abandonment of stock now? Leaning back and covering my nose, I tentatively peered into the den that my squatter had been inhabiting. Nothing else really identifying or interesting, and I figured that we'd have to call the cops to report an intruder, and they could go through this little living area and the warehouse overall and search for any identification or evidence of wrongdoing besides breaking and entering. I was a security guard, not a detective, and it wasn't my job to investigate the crime just to stop it from happening. It felt like an anticlimax, but I was relieved to finally have the matter taken out of my hands. As I backed away from the den and straightened up, I realized 2 things at once. 1, the den was empty, which meant the guy was gone. And 2, the den was empty, which meant the guy could be anywhere. And I fumbled, for my radio dropped the freaking thing because of course I wasn't acting like the manly hero I'd always pictured in those scenarios. Then when I was sure the brick of a unit wasn't broken, I radioed through to the security office. One of my favorite colleagues was on that night, and she was a motherly figure who brought in home-baked goods, and we all affectionately called her Mum. I can't even remember her real name, to be honest with you. And how she ended up in mall security was something I'll never figure out. But of all the senior guards who could be working the cameras on any night, having Mum, there was a particular reassurance. I realize now how weird it must have sounded to be overheard saying, "Mom, I think there's a guy down here," into the radio, but it was the squatter guy who would have heard me, so screw him. Naturally, she radioed back asking me to confirm just what in the blue blazing hell I was talking about and whether I was okay. I didn't even have time to reply when, and I swear to Jesus, Christ Almighty above the lights for the entire warehouse BB building went out. Boom, total pitch, black darkness. And this wasn't something that often happened. There was no fancy timer, no famous generator problems. If the lights went out, it was because someone hit the switches. My mind didn't run through the usual, I'm being pranked nonsense. The nest, the duffel bags, they were not a prank. Nobody I worked with had the imagination or the motivation to pull off something so elaborate. Just wasn't a thing. So the only explanation I even entertained was that the guy who had been living in the mall was still in the warehouse and had just shut off the lights. Thankfully, we carried flashlights on the night shift, and I tried to get mine off of my belt, just as, and I swear to God, I heard footsteps pounding across the warehouse floor, running footsteps coming directly at me fast. The light switches weren't far from where I was. I got my flashlight up just in time to see someone wearing black, a scrawny figure charging straight at me. He barrels into me at just the wrong moment, catching me perfectly off guard, so that I fell right backward, slamming against a shelf. Heard him mutter something, saw him stumble in the waving beam of my flashlight, and then just take off down the aisle. God damn it, what should I even do? I thought I wasn't paid nearly enough to get murdered on the job, but my pride had been hurt and my shoulder, so I got up and ran after him as I radioed to Mum, panting out what details I could, getting frustrated as she kept asking me to repeat things. The guy seemed like he was darting down corridors in the dark, and I was barely keeping up with him using just my flashlight. In the end, I just yelled for Mum to call the cops to the warehouses now and dropped the radio so I could run faster. For a moment I lost him, then I heard a door slam somewhere down a corridor and knew where he must have been headed. There was a small complex of rooms between warehouses A and B, just a break room, a bathroom, etc., and I started jogging down there. And for all I knew, he was waiting on the other side of the door with a machete or a gun or even a fire extinguisher, and I probably didn't take nearly enough care as I burst in. The lights were still on in there, causing me to kind of WS and reel back, and thankfully no weaponized squatter was there waiting for me. Just an open door leading into the bathroom. I went through the open door. The bathrooms in that area were 2 individual rooms, men's and women's, with 1 toilet, 1 sink, etc. in each. These weren't public bathrooms, just for people who had reason to be in the warehouse zone. The women's bathroom was open, and I could see a ceiling vent covering lying on the ground like it had been pulled off and tossed aside. I stepped in and shone my flashlight up into that hole, and I thought I could hear the faint sound of someone crawling away through those vents, but maybe that was just my imagination. I was so fixated on the vent that it took me a moment to notice the writing in the mirror. Now, I can't say for sure that it was from this guy. It could have just been graffiti left by literally anyone at any time, but like I said, these were worker bathrooms, the female bathroom as well. Does that really matter here? I tend to think of women as just generally less likely to vandalize bathrooms, and if that makes me sexist, so be it. I just couldn't imagine anyone doing it in their own workplace. And on the mirror in Sharpie, someone had just written the F word and eat poop, not exactly written like that, laid out exactly like that with the F word on one line and eat poop on the next. Remember the exact wording to this day, and to this day I have no idea if our guys sharply simply just didn't work for the word off after the top line, or if he wrote exactly what he meant to write. Sadly, I can't tell you that I pursued him into those vents like some action hero or Batman, I guess. Absolutely not. Sorry I wasn't about to die in a vent in my S for an almost minimum wage security job. I'm not die hard, and I waited for the cops, who showed up very shortly after. Now I'll rush through what happened next. Basically, the cops investigated, and we had indeed had a squatter living in the mall. He hadn't limited himself to his den in that warehouse. Either the cops, management, and US guards found at least 4 other areas around the mall, and only one of them was in the warehouse. The others, well, we'll just say that he got around the whole complex. It was an old maze-like building, as I said earlier. All that hard to get lost in the corridors and maintenance closets and the vents and the gaps between stores. In every little nest that he had, we found duffel bags and the same black outfits. We never found any boots, though. He'd been wearing heavy boots when he charged me, and I remember those thundering footsteps. I guess his boots meant something to him, so he never changed them. But the clothes, yeah, just these basic black garments and trash loads of food wrappers from stuff that he'd stolen from the warehouse and eaten. Nothing really nutritional, and he must have been in terrible health by the time I chased him off, and we really found nothing else. No sort of manifesto, no sinister plans, no other writing, no ID, no personal belongings. But I always remember how in that first duffel bag there was that one dirty plush cat, and had I thrown that guy's one beloved possession into the dumpster out back? Is that why he told me to F off and eat crap? And that phrase became a running joke around the security guards for a while, until, like all things, had eventually fizzled out. It was kind of just easier to focus on that than consider how incredibly creepy and unsafe it was that someone had been living in the walls of the mall for who knows how long. Probably the same reason. Management was very focused on keeping it covered up. I never found proof that anything truly terrible had happened. But of course the vents and crawl spaces had access to the bathrooms and the private and public ones. There were dressing rooms, all sorts of places for someone to hide, and if they were so inclined, he might even watch. We all publicly agreed that it was better to just not know, as long as he never came back. And you can believe security was pretty tightened up, at least for a while. I left the role about months later, and by then things had calmed down somewhat. But those of us who had been there at the time still talked about that shadow in the walls. So I really don't have any definitive collusion about who this creepy, stinky guy was that knocked me over. And I know that's pretty disappointing, but I do know who he was, sort of, as about years later after I left that job. I was in a very different place and position in life. I was in a relationship with someone who would later become my wife, and she was also from the same town. We'd grown up together, but not together, if that makes sense. The kind of relationship where you meet later in life and remember each other. She knew about that mall shadow, obviously, and many of the other bizarre stories, but this one had always stuck with her, because she'd been to that same mall many times. Even though we lived across the country by that point, my wife, though, we weren't married yet. When this happened, still got our local weekly paper mailed to us by her mum. It was sort of a cute thing, but now I kind of wonder if her mum did it purely for this purpose. There was a story a few pages in about a man who had been arrested. His charges were stalking, harassment, and conspiracy to kidnap. He appeared to be an unhoused individual and had been living pretty rough while repeatedly stalking a handful of women in the area. This time, when they picked him up, they had found a manifesto. According to the newspaper report, it was a notebook that he had just filled with scrawlings about one unnamed young woman in particular. Couldn't find any more about the case online, and never really have, even in the years since. And I guess the charges were eventually dropped, or maybe he died or something. He looked very sickly in his mugshot that they printed out, and I only saw this face once in a sort of frantic flashlight all the way back then while he was charging at me. So I can't be certain, but I know that was him. That was the guy who had been living in those dens throughout that goddamned mall. It just goes to show you that you really never know who's out there. You may never find out what people are thinking or what they might do if pushed just the right way. And sometimes just thinking about that keeps me up at night more than any confirmed murder or direct act of violence. Just the idea that it could happen at any time from anywhere. Story 3. The motorway service station incident. I'm British, and I've got a rather unusual job. My company sends me from place to place, usually at night, across the country, fixing vending machines, jukeboxes, and arcade cabinets. It's not your average job, but it keeps me on the move and offers a bit of adventure. My company hires and trains people to fix whatever devices someone might rent for a public space, whether it's a vending machine full of overpriced snacks or a classic arcade cabinet that still gets played. Most of my work is routine, unclogging space raiders or unjamming a packet of crisps stuck in the prongs of a vending machine. You'd be surprised how often that happens. People always think they can fix it themselves with a thwack, but I wouldn't advise that. It voids the warranty. Now and again things get a bit more interesting. Sometimes I get called halfway across the country to fix a Mario Kart arcade machine. If I'm really lucky, it's a classic arcade cabinet, the kind that's been around since the 80s and is still holding up surprisingly well. Those old machines are built to last. They just need a little maintenance now and then. Tonight, though, I was heading to a service station attached to a mall somewhere on the motorway. It was one of those service stations that only stays open after hours, and tonight was no different. The fast food kiosks were open, and there were a few arcade machines in the corner, but everything else was dark, like an old warehouse waiting to be forgotten. I pulled into the car park. The service station was bathed in the fluorescent glow of its few lights, and it felt like a beacon after my long drive. The massive, unlit mall towered over the service station like a squat, abandoned house. Honestly, I was just happy to get out of the van after hours of driving. I grabbed my bags and trudged into the station, the smell of McDonald's grease and stale air filling my nose. My stomach growled, but I had a strict rule. No food until I was done with the job. The place was pretty quiet. There were a couple of vehicles parked in the lot, nothing too unusual. Inside, I grabbed a cup of black coffee with 2 sugars from the vending machine, then headed to the Mario Kart arcade machine. One of the seats had come loose, and one of the wheels had drift, so I just needed to tighten a few things up. I got it done quicker than expected, half an hour instead of the usual hour. I wasn't one to be hyper-aware of my surroundings, like those true crime buffs who are constantly on edge, but I did notice a few things. The service station had 3 fast food kiosks, each staffed by a bored-looking employee. The main guy behind the counter was a middle-aged man with tattoos running down his arms. He seemed unfazed by the late hour, probably used to the oddball customers like me. There were also some people hanging around. In the back corner sat a group of 3 or 4 teens, at least that's what I assumed. They were all tall, with one noticeably shorter than the others. All were wearing masks, the scarf type that covered everything but their eyes, with their hoodies pulled low. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just being fashionably edgy, or so I hoped. At the center of the room, a table was occupied by 2 women. They looked like they were in their early 20s, chatting quietly. I smiled and nodded at them as I passed. They gave me a polite smile in return, nothing out of the ordinary. I headed to grab my usual meal, a fillet of fish. Yeah, I'm that guy. The worker, looking as grumpy as you'd expect at this hour, handed me my food. I sat down and started eating, finally allowing myself to enjoy the fries. I was halfway through my meal when the group of teenagers in the corner stood up and began making their way toward me. I didn't think too much of it, figuring they were just moving around, but as they approached, I noticed the way they were looking at me, like I was their next target. They didn't speak, just stood there staring. I tried to stay calm. "Can I help you fellas?" I asked, doing my best to sound polite, but not eager to escalate things. I'm no pushover, but I didn't need a fight either. My gaze flicked to the 2 women at the central table, wondering if they were in on this joke, or if they had any idea what was going on. The women kept to themselves, their eyes darting between the group and me. The tension in the air was thick. One of them, tall with a scruffy hoodie, lunged forward and shoved my table. Not too hard, but enough to make me jump. Classic bully behavior. "All right, lads, I'm just trying to unwind after work. I don't want any trouble. You should go on your way," I said, trying to defuse the situation. I swear I heard one of them giggle. It irritated me more than anything. I wasn't sure if it was nervous laughter or if they were trying to get under my skin. The one who shoved my table leaned in, his breath hot. "You got a problem, mate?" I raised an eyebrow. "No, mate. Just trying to eat my burger." He echoed me, mocking me in a high-pitched tone. "No, mate. Just trying to eat my burger." The third tall one slammed a fist down on the table. My drink toppled, and I caught it just in time to stop it from spilling everywhere. I wasn't in the mood for their games. "Come on, lads," I said, standing up. "It's not worth it, is it?" I hadn't noticed that the short one had circled behind me while the others distracted me. Suddenly, I felt hands on my shoulders. The grip was light but firm, and I immediately tensed. "Not worth it," the voice whispered in my ear. It was soft and faint, almost like a child's voice. It sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't tell if it was a girl or a little kid, but something felt off. I didn't react right away, unsure whether to make a move or try to calm things down. "All right, forget this," I said, stepping away from the table. I grabbed my bags, keeping my eyes on the group, and made my way toward the exit. I could hear them muttering behind me. "Oi, mate, you're sticking around," one of them shouted, his voice full of mockery. I didn't want any more trouble. I dealt with schoolyard bullies growing up, but this was something else. When I reached the car park, I hoped the service station worker would have the sense to lock the doors behind them, but maybe these kids were known to the staff. Maybe this kind of thing happened here all the time. As I fumbled for my van keys, I noticed the 2 women from earlier watching us from the window. They were still sitting at the same table, their heads tilted toward the car park, observing the situation. The group of teens was about 10 meters away from me, standing still in the middle of the parking lot, watching me closely. I didn't want to turn my back on them, so I opened the passenger door of my van and threw my bags inside, keeping one eye on the group. My hand casually slipped a socket wrench out of my bag and tucked it up my sleeve. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. "All right, I'm off, lads," I called, trying to sound confident as I backed around to the driver's side. I figured it would be better to keep engaging them instead of acting like I was scared. They didn't move, just watched me. My stomach churned as I slid into the van and started the engine. As I put the van into reverse, I thought maybe I was in the clear. Then they charged. Suddenly, they sprinted toward the van, slapping and banging on the bonnet, hooting and hollering like wild animals. I jumped, my heart racing. They laughed harder, their taunts growing louder. I slammed my foot on the gas, peeling out of the car park in a U-shape, almost clipping a bollard in the process. They kept running after me, still laughing, slapping the sides of the van as I sped away. For a moment, I wondered if I should have just run them over, but I knew better. That would have only made things worse for me, especially if one of them was really just a kid. I stopped at the next service station, checked the van, and found a long scratch down the side, thin, like it had been scraped with a knife. I called my boss, who told me to report it to the police. The officers said they'd swing by, but I never heard anything else about it. What stuck with me, though, was the way they lost control at the end. It was like they were wild beasts, acting on instinct, not thinking about the consequences. And the thing that scared me the most, I'm not sure they ever intended to let me go. Story 4. I live in a country where certain dark, uncomfortable topics are often left unspoken, hidden away, as if simply mentioning them might give them power. One of these unspeakable things is a story my mother told me, a tale that haunts me to this day, even though I was far too young to fully understand the significance when she first shared it. In my town, there used to be a shopping centre, a mall, that I remember fondly from my childhood. It was a place that held the kind of magic that only a child could see. Bright lights, the hum of people, the scent of freshly baked cookies, and the constant swirl of life around me. It was a place of wonder. The food court was the heart of it all. It was filled with an array of smells, tacos, burgers, fried food, and the sight of steaming cups of coffee being handed over to busy patrons. I remember the kiosks with their vibrant displays of shiny toys and bright, colourful clothes. I always imagined myself wearing them someday, perhaps as a teenager or an adult, walking through the mall with my friends, laughing, the world stretched out before me. Those were the days when I believed everything in the world was possible. I loved running through the mall, darting between stores, stopping to stare in awe at the toys that looked so futuristic, so special. Every corner offered something new, from gadgets to clothes, from books to games. And even though I didn't fully understand it at the time, the energy of the place was infectious. The mall was a microcosm of the world outside, a place where anything could happen. Then, when I was about 6 years old, we were told the mall would be closing. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I remember crying because, at that young age, I couldn't fathom why such a wonderful place would close its doors. My father worked there, and I was terrified he would lose his job. But my father didn't work for the mall directly. He was the manager of a store inside the mall, a men's fashion shop that had been thriving for years. His job wasn't in danger, but I didn't know that back then. As I grew older, I moved on from my childhood sadness and forgot about the mall. It seemed like a distant memory, a place that was part of a different life, a different time. But years later, when I returned home for a visit, I heard the news that the mall had been demolished. They had torn it down. It wasn't until then that I learned the true story behind its closure. It happened one summer night, long after the mall had closed for the day. The building itself was a strange mix of old and modern, tall and imposing, with several floors that seemed to stretch up into the sky. The ground floor housed the food court, which was always bustling with families and shoppers. The second floor was a mix of toys, electronics, and other fun items. Above that were clothing and home goods, and the top floor had offices and a stationery shop. I loved the openness of the building, the way the center was open to the sky, and the large sculpture that stood in the middle of the atrium. I can still remember how the sunlight would shine through, casting rainbows across the floors. The floors were surrounded by reinforced glass barriers that stretched high, protecting anyone from falling over the sides. I remember craning my neck to look down from the top floor balcony, straining to see all the way to the bottom, but the glass was so high I couldn't fully peer over it. For an adult, the glass would have reached about chest height. My father's store was on the third floor, and it was a hub of activity, especially during the holidays. But that summer, something unusual happened. The store hosted an exclusive product release, a collaboration between the store and a famous fashion designer. The event was small. A select group of journalists and influencers gathered to preview the latest designs. It was after hours, and the mall had already closed its doors to the public, but my father's store still had a few people inside, attending the event. It was late that night when something occurred that no one could have predicted, something that changed the mall's history forever. My mother had gone outside, though she couldn't explain why. She says she doesn't remember needing fresh air, but she stepped out for a moment nonetheless. She was no more than a minute outside when she saw it. A man fell from the sky. He was dressed in a brown business suit, his jacket flapping in the air as he descended. His tie snapped behind him like a whip. As he fell, one of his shoes came off and flew in a wild arc, his body twisting in mid-air. His face, frozen with shock and terror, vanished from my mother's view before he hit the ground. What struck her the most was that he didn't scream, not a sound. There was no cry of fear or distress. Nothing. My mother said that she will never forget how quiet it was. It was as though the world had held its breath, waiting for something horrible to happen. And then it did. The man hit the floor with a sickening, bone-crushing thud, a sound that would haunt her for years. My mother never spoke of what happened afterward, but I know enough to understand that when a body falls from that height, it is no longer a body when it hits the ground. What remains is an awful mess, something that can never be cleaned up, something that no amount of time or effort can erase. But that wasn't the only reason the mall was shut down that night. The man who fell was not just anyone, he was the owner of the mall. The mall had been struggling financially for some time, and its management company was on the brink of bankruptcy. Authorities were quick to label the incident as a tragic accident. They believed the owner had somehow slipped, perhaps leaning over the railing to adjust something or clean, but some people speculated that there was more to the story. Some believed he hadn't been alone that night, that there was someone else involved, or that it had been something more deliberate, but no one could say for sure. Out of respect for the man's family, and because of the cultural taboo surrounding tragedies like this, people learned to keep their questions to themselves. The mall was never reopened. The demolition of the building followed shortly after, leaving nothing behind but rubble and the ghosts of a time long past. The memory of the man who fell from the sky lingers in my mind to this day, a reminder of how quickly life can change and how fragile we all are. And as for the mall, the city has since built something new in its place, but it's hard to forget the dark history that once haunted that spot. Some places, some stories just can't be erased. Story 5. Damn, it was cold. He had been told just how cold it was, but hearing it will be 50 degrees and experiencing it are two different things. The copter glided over Queen Maud Land at 200 feet, the wind leaking through Jack Valance's parka, even with the heat tubes running at full strength. The sun just peaked above Ulvatana Peak, high noon for this time of year in Antarctica. Jack had his Farsight all-light binoculars affixed to his goggles, allowing him to scan the frigid landscape. There wasn't much out here. Most of the bases were on the coast, along with the penguin colonies. There could be an Euro-U military operation out here, but he probably wouldn't be that lucky. There would be no climbers this time of year, thankfully. Even in the 24th century, mountain climbing remained dangerous, and this time of year storms were frequent. "You spotted it yet, Captain?" Sergeant Hal Kilmore looked perturbed, but he normally looked that way. He wanted to get back to the heat at McMurdo. They all did, but they needed to clean up this mess first. Jack needed to find the Grant hold to start. The smuggling ship had gone down somewhere around here, and its cargo had gotten loose on the Antarctic ice. "Not yet, Sigma-1, it will be soon enough." For almost any cargo that ship could have carried, Antarctica itself would have dealt with it, and if it were left alone, it still might. The Legranth was a dangerous predator and illegal in 12 systems, including Sol. Plucked from a frozen hellhole nearly 200 light-years away, it was often smuggled as a trophy for the greatest menageries. This one was shot down with the ship by system defense forces when illegal contraband was scanned aboard their ship. It was those scanners that detected the creature, and why Jack and his team were sent here with 2 hours of the ship crashing. Jack saw in the distance the makings of a squall, the horizon blanked out by white. He scanned closer and then spotted the wreckage of the ship, spread out over a mile on the glacier. He spotted the cargo hold and pulled himself back to the center of the copter. "Over there, pilot," as Jack pointed. "Set us down right there and take gunship position. My team will try to handle it, but if it starts to get away, take it down." He had faced a Lagranth before, a vicious and deadly opponent. It could blend into the white easily, even without changing its color. Lagranths were ambush predators, often stalking its prey for hours before it pounced, killing with one blow when it attacked. Antarctica possessed no such fauna that could match it. Had the Granthold crashed in the Arctic, the Lagranth would likely end up in the belly of a polar bear, or a pack of wolves. Here, it could feast on penguins if it found them, tourists or scientists. The copter swung low over the downed ship and landed with a crunch in the snow. Jack got off first, and then the 4 other members of his team. "Fan out and keep your infrareds on. This thing is hot. I don't need anyone dying today. Find it and call in the team to take it down. Keep an eye on your batteries. They drain in the cold, and your suit's heat systems will not last forever." Aye, ayes answered back. Jack headed right for the ship, swinging his Beretta MX-28 around as he searched the area. The rifle was a little obsolete, as it still used jacketed rounds instead of flechettes or lasers. It was reliable, and the cold had no effect on it. He wanted a weapon that would work when he needed it to. The snow cracked under his feet, his boots sinking in the powder up to his ankle as he approached the ship. A body lay in the snow, outside of the ripped hole in the side of the ship. The man's throat had been ripped out, his blood frozen. A small laser pistol lay next to his hand, already frozen stiff when Jack pushed on it with his foot. The crash looked like it had created the hole. It was wide enough for a large Lagranth to escape. Walking inside the ruined ship, there were 2 more bodies, both killed by teeth rather than the crash, and a metal cage ripped open. "It's on the loose, gentlemen. Keep your eyes up and scanning. It is likely still around here." Corporal Jenkins grunted. "Will do, Captain. I definitely want to get back and have a few poppies." "Keep it tight, men. This is no jolly. Captain, I have 2 corpses inside the cockpit, dead from the crash. There is a 3rd outside, about 50 yards from the ship. Large prints headed towards it. This one was attacked." Sergeant Kilmore was all business. Of his team, Kilmore was the only one that had been on a Lagranth hunt before. "Team, check in every 5 minutes. Remember, you see it, call for backup." He looked to the horizon, stepping outside the ship. That storm looked closer. "Gunship, how far are those clouds?" "Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15. Do you want dust off before?" Jack thought for a second. "No. We need to find this thing and deal with it. If we leave it to the storm, it may get away, and there could be more fatalities before it dies out here. Our gear should keep us safe." He hoped that were true. Antarctica was the most hostile place on the surface of the Earth, and death was never far away. He started to wall around the perimeter of the downed ship, looking for prints in the snow. The low level of light started to fade as they walked. The bare mountain tops and nunataks contrasted with the glistening white, their browns and blacks drawing the eye to them as the bit of contrast. "Sigma team, sit rep. Sigma 1, all clear. Sigma 2, all clear. Sigma 3, all clear." Jack waited for a few moments. "Sigma 4, check in. Sigma 4, check in." Static answered. "Gunship, do you have eyes on 4? The wind blew a bit harder, and Jack could feel the suit matching it. "Sigma 4 down, near the cockpit." "Team, converge on Sigma 4's location. Gunship, do we have any infrared readings at all?" "None besides the team, Captain. I'll even be able to track you once the storm gets here." Jack reached the cockpit after Sigma 2 and 3 had. Corporals Benedict and Lovren respectively stood over the body, checking vitals and scanning the area. Sergeant Kilmore arrived last, breathless. "Captain, I believe I spotted it, but there was nothing in the infrared. It vanished behind a bit of wreckage, and when I pursued, all trace had gone." If Kilmore was correct, then the situation had just gotten a lot worse. While all Lagranths could change this color like a chameleon, only the oldest males could change other things, suppressing smell, body heat, and even becoming nearly invisible. The upside was that they couldn't do these things for very long, as it took an enormous amount of energy. So, either it did this in short bursts, being invisible to the team, or it ate more of the crew to fuel this. "Team, this one has the ability to suppress infrared, and it likely has encountered humans before, knowing how we hunt. Orders are, if you get a shot, take it Don't wait for backup. We will go in pairs, Sigma 1 with me, 2 and 3 together. Gunship, collect Sigma 4's body before the storm gets here, then resume station. Let's search in pattern Foxtrot. Foxtrot meant that the teams would go in ever-widening circles, slowly growing the cleared area with each revolution. More so than finding the creature, Jack hoped that it would flush it out, allowing the team to strike. He kept an eye on the horizon, watching the white line get closer and closer. His suit chimed at him, temperature warning. Antarctica was playing its hand, the temperature rapidly dropping ahead of the weather. The EnviroSuit was rated to 65 F degrees before failure, and the temperature on his watch stated 59 F degrees. Past the limit, the cold would rapidly degrade their abilities, but the suit's material should prevent them from freezing to death, at least for a while. The light started to fade, the sun disappearing behind the mountains. Such a short daylight period, but if there was one thing that gave the advantage to his team, it would be the lack of light. Night vision was nearly as good as daylight, and the Legranth had no technology. Jack and Sigma 1 continued to move, and he saw both 2 and 3 in their pattern. Only the sound of snow crunching under his boots broke the silence. The wind for a moment quieted down, a calm before the brutal assault that bared down on them. It tempted Jack to marvel at the beautiful place they were in, but then 3 shots rang out. "Report!" Jack yelled. "False alarm, Captain." The wind immediately picked up, and Jack watched the white line rapidly approach them. The air howled, and he felt ice creep into his suit at his feet and his face, and then it engulfed them. He had to shout to even hear himself think. The whiteout both blinded and deafened him. Jack strained his ears, and he could hear the muffled sounds of laser blasts. "Team, the blizzard is going to scatter your range. This is a knife fight now." Their largest advantage, range, was now gone. He called up on his HUD the infrared view from the gunship, showing the locations of his team members. The temperature alarm beeped faster, and then a continual tone as the temperature passed the limit. He shut it off and resumed his search. The chronometer showed an additional 15 minutes passed when he discovered his first footprint from the Legranth. Its splayed-out 6 toes clearly showed which direction it traveled, a sign that it was getting sloppy. Legranth's tails swept the ground behind them, dispersing most footprints and smells with a gland in it. "Team prints found. Narrow hex grid search to 342 and 352. Radiate out from that. Gunship, circle that area." A burst of wind cut through the Arctic ski mask, burning his cheeks. "Captain, Sigma 2 and 3 have not left their positions." "Gunship, are their comms working?" "Yes." "Sigma 1, maintain search. I will move towards them." Both corporals were dead, their throats ripped open, and steaming blood poured into the snow. Jack heard a sickening scream behind him, and he turned, leveling his rifle towards where it came from. "Captain, I can't see Sigma 1 anymore." "Understood, Gunship. 2 and 3 are down. Await confirmation that Legranth is neutralized before retrieval." He wanted to leave in that moment, a feeling he never would admit to anyone. He couldn't abandon his team here, dead or alive, and somehow this thing could find them in this weather. It would stalk him first, and then strike him before too long. "God, I need an assist on this one." God answered with the mercury dropping even more, and the wind roaring even louder. Numbness began creeping into his fingers, and he felt the chill throughout his body. Powerful help indeed, as the Legranth was definitely beyond its ability to survive in the open. Antarctica itself was trying to kill it. Jack started to move towards the ruins of the cargo hold. The Legranth would have to find some shelter, and the only shelter it knew was that hold. Hopefully, he would get to it first and prepare for its arrival. He saw the outline of the hold when he got within 20 feet of it. Jack crouched down and entered the jagged hole. The illumination continued to flicker, and the wind was just a dull roar when Jack planted himself as far from the hole as he could. He lay prone and waited. "Captain, we have a faint infrared signal approaching your position." Jack thought for a moment. "Do you have a visual on it?" "No, Captain. There is 0 visibility here. We are having difficulty maintaining position with these conditions, burning fuel. We have 15 minutes left on station before we need to head back and refuel." "If this isn't over in 10, head back." Jack sucked in his breath and blinked, clearing his eyes. The wind whistled into the opening, and suddenly the noise stopped. It was outside, blocking the wind. He slowly blew it out, and he saw a massive white paw step into the hole. The creature slunk low, all white, except for its muzzle red with blood and piercing grey eyes. It was the size of a large tiger, the fur rippling through its body as it moved. Its ears lay pinned back, snow dripping off its white nose as it crept into the hold. Jack steadied his aim. He would only get one shot before it struck. It didn't react to him, probably as it didn't see him. He lined his eye up with the iron sights, and his HUD automatically showed him where he would hit it. He breathed in. The Lagranth opened its jaw, exposing rows of sharp teeth and a forked tongue. Steam rolled out of its maw, and it sniffed the air. Jack's finger tightened around the trigger, the moment of truth creeping closer. The creature took one more step into the cargo hold, and then a shot rang out from outside. The creature roared and spun around. The green spot on its hindquarters showed that it was hit. Jack fired his shot, striking it in the belly. The Lagranth roared and turned back around to face Jack. He fired again, hitting it in the shoulder, and then it was on top of him. It battered him with his paws, rolling Jack over onto his back. The Lagranth tried to bite him, and Jack forced his Beretta lengthway into its jaws, trying to hold the creature's mouth off of him. Its hot breath stunk of rotting flesh and bile. Its tongue wrapped around his right hand, its saliva wetting his gloves. It took both hands to hold the rifle up, a battle he was slowly losing. Jack kicked as hard as he could in its belly. At the second kick, its growl grew and it placed a paw on his shoulder, digging its claws into his suit, tearing the fabric easily. He stifled his scream, his vision reddening. He pushed the pain away in his mind and focused on his feet, trying to kick the belly wound of the creature. Green ichor sprayed out over his boot, staining the ground as well. Jack was losing this battle. Kicking the wound had to hurt the Lagranth, but it wouldn't kill it before it overpowered him and finished him off. He couldn't reach for his sidearm, as he needed both hands to hold his rifle, keeping the creature off of him. There was only one thing he could do. God, forgive me my sins, and those of my men. He worked out in his head what would happen next. There was a small amount of time when he let go of the rifle, where he could grab his pistol, and then try to fatally wound the creature before he was mauled to death. Jack breathed once, twice, and before he could breathe a third, a shot rang out. The creature roared and released the rifle, crooning its head up in pain. Jack didn't hesitate. He swung the rifle around and pulled the trigger. He pulled and pulled it as he was covered in emerald blood. He kept pulling as the clip ran dry. The corpse rolled to the side and Jack spit, clearing his mouth. "Captain, figured you could use a hand." Kilmore stood in the opening of the hold. Jack sat up and smiled. "I needed all the help I could get." "How?" Kilmore set his weapon down. "I figured I would use the weather to help me. I buried in the snow as soon as I knew the team was down. I screamed to draw it towards me. I think it might have, except that Antarctica decided that it was going to force the fight indoors. Then it was just waiting until it got there, which your shot gave it away." "So the first shot was the gunship. Pilot, are you still overhead?" "Yes, sir. Target neutralized." "Yes, we are ready for pickup. Retrieve Sigma 2 and 3 first." "Aye, aye." Kilmore offered his hand to pull Jack up. "Sergeant, I can't thank you enough. It sounds like the wind is dying down." They moved to the opening, and the wind was dying down, the storm passing their location. "Yes, Captain, it seems the ice itself joined our fight." "Maybe so, Sergeant. Maybe so. Can't say I would turn it down in the future." The clear night sky spread over Jack. Looking up at the stars, there was enough light to see across Queen Maud's land and the frozen majesty of Antarctica. He wouldn't look at it the same again.